Alrighty, so I'm just going to set that and let it go. Alright, hello everyone, hello MIGW, hello Melbourne, hello everybody else who happens to be watching this. This is the Evolutions of Gaming panel, where we four are going to be sitting here and discussing the ways that we think that games are going to change and develop in the next sort of 5 years to a decade or so. Some of the cool ideas in both technology and general game design that we see upcoming. And I'm going to go reverse order across the table for us all to introduce ourselves. Would you like to start, Nellie?
Yes, hello. I'm Nellie. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a PhD student at the University of Melbourne looking at how museums use games. And on top of that, I also run Melbourne Megagames. And I'm going to leave you to look up what Megagames are and pass on to Sid.
Thank you.
We'll provide a link.
G'day, my name's Sidney. I use they, them pronouns. I am the principal consultant for a company called Waxwings. I do game design consulting here in Melbourne. I've got about 10 to 13 years of experience in game design around military, healthcare, crisis simulation sort of stuff.
Cool. Hello, I am Lucy. I am an associate lecturer at the University of Melbourne. I do a lot of research around games, in particular ethics in games. I've also recently been doing a lot of research into hybrid digital board games and exploring that area in a bit more detail.
And just to cap us all off, because I have not introduced myself yet, my name is Lee Cope. I'm also a PhD candidate at RMIT. I'm studying urban play and location-based gaming, and I have a background in TTRPG, event management and design. I like to call myself a narrative designer and or a purveyor of fine falsehoods on my business cards. And I use its pronouns. So, let's get us kicked off with a quick sort of overview of what we're going to be talking about here, and then I'll pass off to these other wonderful people to have all the intelligent ideas. So what we're sort of talking about here is that in recent times we've seen a real explosion in the types of games that are being made and produced. So sort of from Megagames to my research in ARGs to TTRPGs to digital games, and games as educational tools and workplace training and that sort of thing. And we see some really interesting methods of combining not only technologies but also design elements of different styles of gaming in order to create more interesting games, more interesting new game mediums, and to really sort of explore the ways in which we can use all the tools available to us in order to make games the best thing that they can be. So Lucy, why don't you kick us off talking a little bit about board games and digital tools, because you said that you had some master's students doing some interesting things there.
Yes, so I've been doing a lot of work with Dr. Melissa Rogerson, who is really, really big in the board games research space, looking at how we can develop and design hybrid digital board games, where that would be defined as tabletop games that integrate certain kinds of technologies, whether that's projectors or an app or anything you can think of, right? We've had some master students creating hybrid digital board games from scratch. So we had a really cool one, for instance, that basically made two separate boards that allowed two people to play a board game at a distance. So they were not physically co-located. The boards would essentially mirror each other through technology, sensors, and so on. So if you move your piece on one board, the piece gets moved, or an indicator shows that that piece was moved on the other board as well. And I think what's most exciting about that space is, first of all, integrating technology into games is pretty exciting, and some people think it's very much a gimmick, and it can be kind of gimmicky, but it can also be a really, really new and interesting, and I'm sure you'll all have really interesting things to say about this as well, a really new and interesting way to frame play and to actually introduce new kinds of interactions. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think Sidney might have some things to say about that in terms of adding digital as a gimmick rather than as a value add to the game as well, because you've worked a lot with sort of digital systems and things.
Yeah, there's always a big question about how good digital looks. When you're trying to display a product, a game as a product to a decision maker in a company, or to a commanding officer in the military, or to an audience that you're trying to sell it to, digital lets you be flashy and lets you add those, like, if we use like MDA framework sort of stuff, lets you add like that sensation play of like flashy juice and audio effects. But in reality, a lot of the learning and development comes from those early integrated tabletop parts of the development, and then the digital is kind of slapped on at the end as a way to sell the learning that comes out of it.
Because I remember when we were first setting up this conversation, we were sort of going over it. We sat down at a cafe and we just had a chat about what we were going to talk about. And one of the first things that we noticed that we'd done is immediately jumped to hybrid means, adding digital tools to a tabletop or an analog game, Megagame framework. And that's actually something we wanted to kind of, I know we've started there, but we did want to avoid that in this panel, because I think we got into, I'm going to rekindle an argument that we had. Nellie, would you like to give us some opinions on whether or not you can digitize gaming as a game, digitize tabletop gaming and maintain the experience?
Yeah, so there's some context that needs to come out for how I got to this opinion point. And I also need to disclaim that this is not a like fully fledged opinion that I hold, but a space that I am trying to provoke conversation in as part of my work. So I did a study earlier this year where I ran a game of D&D, or several games of D&D at a museum. And because my work is situated in human-computer interaction, there is always this element of, well, what are museums doing with technology, and what are they doing with technology-based games? And so I designed this study that was completely absent of technology to see whether that was going to produce the same results that museums are hoping to achieve when they go about and design functionally like a scavenger hunt in an app. And what I found was that, firstly, because of D&D's appeal, the event was really, really popular, which is kind of what I was expecting. But that when probed on that technology element, everyone was like, no, I don't want technology in my D&D. And from unpacking what some of those players and GMs had said, it basically came down to, well, the kinds of stories that we want to tell through D&D and the responsiveness of the human element is something that a computer cannot replicate, and so we don't want it. And I think I've slightly evolved my thought on this now, which is that, especially when we're talking about gimmicks, people get really excited about technology and bits of technology. And that leads to creating a lot of really shit products until eventually someone does something really clever, and then that is the thing that becomes ubiquitous, and it is done very, very well. And I think we're kind of in that space with hybrid games specifically. Go forth, argue with me.
Yeah, no, I mean, I was the one that would take it to the mat on that one, because I think that if I've learned anything in years and years of playtesting with players, it's that as much as I love them, and for the people who are watching, I'm a player experience-led designer. We share that in our philosophy. Players are actually real bad. I took some time there because I don't know what our rating is on this. Players are horrendous at expressing what they do and don't want.
Yeah.
They're very good at expressing how they feel, or how gameplay made them feel.
Yeah.
They're very bad at looking forward.
Yeah.
And it's the same as any technological improvement in any community. Everyone says you can't do it until someone does.
Yeah.
And then you hit your tipping point, and then
That's
it becomes, ubiquitous, as you said, it becomes adopted throughout society. And that when people say, oh, technology, computers can't help us tell the types of stories we want to tell, what I'm hearing from them is, we don't trust that technology can help us do that. Whether or not they can is a problem for the engineers.
Yeah.
And there was also a discussion point that we had a little bit as well, which was that technology can't do things like we were talking about aftercare in D&D, where we've all had sessions where everybody got together after the TTRPG, whatever it was, and sat down and went, so some characters died, some stuff went down, how are we all feeling? And that kind of responsiveness, or looking at a table full of players and going, someone looks uncomfortable, I should check in, is not something that technology at this point can do. And that came up as a bit of a concern. But as Sid very astutely pointed out, neither can a bad human GM.
Which is interesting, because I think if you consider something like technology facilitated play, so if you're playing the same TTRPG but through Discord, it's actually much easier to deal with some of those issues as they come up, because you can just quietly message someone, because you're all already on the screen, so it's not an issue of like, well, I need to pull my phone out of the table. And that can get handled more discreetly, which can create a smoother experience for everyone. It's interesting.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. In a recent study that we did looking at how players homebrewed their own hybrid digital board games to play at a distance during the pandemic. So, people who wanted to have that physical kind of play experience, that tangibility, alongside being able to play with friends and family who they weren't currently living with and weren't able to see in person. A lot of them were sort of, remind me again, what were you saying?
About like technology facilitated play has a set of affordances that actually just make it different from like fully face-to-face play. And some of those, like there's a tendency to immediately assume that technology facilitated play is of a lower quality than fully face-to-face.
Yes, and the communication is what you're saying.
Yeah.
So a lot of people were, for instance, using technology alongside their play, like by communicating on Discord, to convey hidden information to other players, right? And although the overall experience of trying to homebrew your own hybrid distance board game was incredibly cumbersome for a lot of people, it was also, it introduced these interesting elements that technology can actually fulfill, like these interesting functions, like allowing you to share and receive hidden information in a way that you can't do when sitting around the table.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing that's really interesting about hybridity for me, is that what I understood as one of the conclusions of that research is that hybrid games are like a fundamentally different category to analog games with technology or digital games. Because the best ones that I've personally played have been the ones where like the technology has been used in a really interesting way. And by fundamentally different, I mean it is where the technology, like without that technology, if you just took it away, the game would not exist. So quite like demarcated from board games with apps, where even though the app is super helpful and it's doing a lot of high level housekeeping, you could just assign that to a person to sit and do. So there's a great game that I've played with some of the other PhD students where you're trying to be a cat burglar, and so you strap your phone to your wrist and it uses the like motion sensor in your phone, and you've got to move your hand in as slowly as possible to try and steal tokens from the middle. And if you move too fast, it sets off the alarm and the sound goes off and everyone can see, and then you have to put your hand back and sit. That's not a game that you can play without that component.
Similar to one of my favourite ever uses of VR technology at the moment is a game, I think it's called Overlord. We've got show notes, we'll pop some links. But it's a game where it's a 2-player local PvP or player versus player game where one person has the VR headset and is looking around, and one person has a controller and is looking at the screen. The person with the headset sees from the point of view of this stationary but rotatable big machine object thing with a laser coming out of the front of its face. And the player with the controller has to wander up a series of stairs with lots of hidden corners in amongst a whole bunch of non-player or computer characters that are all walking in a very like computer AI kind of way in these big rows. And they have to get up to the top and steal a gem, basically. They just have to touch it. Or they have to bring their character model in contact with it within a certain distance. The goal of the person who has the VR headset on is to look around and direct this laser, and if they focus on one of the moving people for long enough, it will fry them. Their goal is to find the player character, but not within, I think they have 10 incorrect guesses or something like that. They can only fry a certain number of things before it's auto win for the player. But one of the major things that made that so interesting for me is that you have two people sitting on a couch right next to each other in a hidden information game where all of the information is on screens. Because the VR headset prevents the overlord character from seeing the screen that the player character sees and seeing where the player character is from their own view. And the player character, if they're hidden behind a thing, they can't see where the overlord is looking unless they can see the laser from their vantage point on the screen. And that is a beautiful way to do a hidden information game and be able to have the players in such close proximity that the overlord character might hear the player character go shit, 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 but not know what's happened or what's going on.
Totally.
It's such an interesting counterpoint to all of that like distanced play, and how like the interesting thing there with the distance play stuff was how are people playing games at a distance using technology, and this is, well, how are people playing games co-located with technology?
And the interesting thing as well is that in both cases, the idea is that technology is offering this really interesting affordance of managing and leveraging hidden information, right?
It's all right. We've got enough light. We're all good.
Cool. So I think that that's something really important to explore when thinking about technology in games, in whatever form, is what can technology be doing and helping me do in ways that I can't actually do without it? Right? Particularly when it comes to how do we share information, say, secretly to another player.
You look like you're having thoughts, Sid.
I'm having heaps of thoughts. As soon as you start talking about things like secret information or hidden information, we get to this really interesting question of trust. And this has kind of been a bit of a bugbear for me the last couple of days at least, so maybe it's just one of those things that's front of mind. But we have a really interesting relationship at the moment with trust and technology and digital landscapes. And in some ways that trust is greater. So your cat burglar example, Nellie, there is a trust that your phone's gyroscope or whatever, your accelerometer is accurate and is measuring something meaningful. As opposed to my favorite example is if you have a game that involves flipping a coin or rolling dice or something like that, it really takes 2 or 3 unexpected results for that to break a player's trust in whatever resolution system is. Either the game's cheating or the game's broken, and it's this interesting discussion around having hidden information or having the technology mediate times when you need to separate people. So whether it's a resolution system or whether it's an information distribution system, in both cases you need that system to be really conceptually easy for players to understand so that they can very quickly build trust with your technology.
I have a question that I'm going to take us on a very brief tangent, but I'm going to throw out an interesting, well, hopefully it's interesting. When you're talking about trust, one of the things that I've come across in other circumstances, particularly in some of my work with policy development and analysing how people react to different policies that are put in, there is absolutely, trust is important. You have to trust that the system is doing what it is supposed to do, or that the system will achieve the outcome that it purports to achieve, and that you also want the system to achieve this outcome. But one of the other big axes is consistency. And I think that may come into gaming systems in an interesting way as well. Not only do you have to trust that the system isn't broken or that the system is doing what the system says it does, you have to trust that the system is applying either the same set of rules for everybody or is applying the same set of rules in the same kind of way from game to game. So for example, we know that Mario Kart is a cheating bastard. We accept that AI will rubber band in Mario Kart because we know that AI will always rubber band in Mario Kart. Then it becomes part of the system itself. But because players can see that and respond to it, it doesn't come across as, well, for some players it does come across as the AI is a cheating bastard, but like...
Yeah, it's really interestingly about expectations. It's so much less about it actually being fair. So I'm sure we have some designers on here. The first trap for every new designer is they say this is a percentage-based chance and the percentages are fair. And the first feedback they'll get from players is this is unfair. This is where it gets me. It's because our brains are fundamentally broken when it comes to probability. There's a really great classic Sid Meier quote where he talks about how a player who wins at 33% at like a 2-to-1 against chance is a tactical genius, and a player who loses at 1-to-2 against it at 66% chance was robbed by a machine. And like we tend to, as players, blame ourselves for our victories and blame others for our defeats. And so the discussion around like your system needs to be strictly fair and very like clean and transparent, it's really interesting when we get into hybrid games, because the expectation of a digital system is that it's going to cheat in the player's favor because that's what feels like correct play. But in analog systems, we haven't built that as a design culture because you don't need to cheat players into thinking it's fair, because when you physically roll a die in front of a player, they have bought in, they have faith in the model, they have bought into that fairness. And so if you're going to create a hybrid environment, one of the problems you're going to come up against, and it's a problem I think without a solution in current design culture, is that your analog system is going to be transparent and fair and players will have bought into it, and your digital system is going to be convoluted and weighted and designed to like lead players down an emotive pathway. And then those two in a hybrid environment are going to clash, and that's going to be like your waveform. That's going to be the tsunami that pushes through your resolution of your game design.
And I think that that's also interesting because it ties into this notion of so how we can actually, how in tabletop games, right, we often negotiate rules, right? Like we often look at rules, and I think we have a PhD student in Melbourne Uni looking into how we negotiate rules in games in comparison to how we might play them with an AI, for instance, or how a machine might interpret things. That there's the social element to games. If something doesn't feel fair in a game, when we're playing in person with a material game, then we negotiate and we make it feel fair, ideally, right?
Yeah.
I'm reminded of the chunky salsa rule that gets implemented in some D&D games.
I don't know that rule.
It does not matter what the dice say, what you rolled. If a situation would reduce the player's head, the character's head to the consistency of chunky salsa, the character is dead.
Interesting. Okay. Very interesting.
Yeah, it doesn't matter how many hit points that would technically take off you or what bonuses you have. If the logical outcome of the fiction is death, then the outcome should be death.
This is one of my greatest bugbears with my baby, is that I played a game in which I was a rogue assassin shadow monk, and she would like shadow step behind people, so appear out of shadows and stab them. And then it would be, roll 1d4 damage for your dagger! And I'd be like, cool.
Yeah, and that's that sort of endogenous design. So endogenous endo from within Genesis creation. So like people within the game creating the rules of the game is really like core to communal design environments with negotiable predictive models, right? Like we don't have the similar thing when you play Fortnite, we can't negotiate that we want to make shotguns less strong for whatever reason, right? That sort of endogenous design is really nice and responsive in environments that have semi-strict or like less rigid rule sets. The free parking rule of Monopoly is, classic examples.
Yeah.
But as soon as we start to digitize things, so when you go to, Monopoly Go or app-based or whatever, we can't endogenously design anything because in order to do that, the designers would need to create systems that allow us to alter their design. And at that point, we kind of run the risk of breaking it in a way that's irreparable.
So that is exactly what Matthew's research showed. So Matthew Sidney is the PhD student that Lucia referred to. And his study was with AI agents playing Hanabi. And so that's what he has termed a partial information restricted communication game.
Hanabi's the fireworks?
Yeah, so it's everyone else can
Yeah.
see your cards, and you can see everyone else's but not your own, and then you're trying to put them down in a specific sequence. And what he found from observing people play a lot of Hanabi is all of these negotiated rules and grey rules where the way that you're holding your cards will tell other people, and it's this theory of mind reasoning. I know that you know that I know this, that AI agents can't do, and it makes them really poor players for that specific type of game. But a lot of the other work that's being done on that is looking at, well, how can we make them better at that? And it's interesting, I think, also in the way that we conceptualize what an AI agent is much more expansive than what it is in reality.
Yeah.
And once again, that's touching on the point of looking towards what technology can actually do that is new and cool, rather than just trying to force it to do things that it might not be suitable for.
And I want to sort of shift us a little bit sideways from this discussion, because we've come back to that point a couple of times now of using technology in order to add a different element or a different experience to a game, rather than using technology in order to replace one of the elements of the game, which is, I think, the difference between a digital aid or a digital tool and true hybridization. Because one of the things that we discussed in the last conversation that we had about this was that, which is a pet theory of mine, which will be published as research at some point, I just need to figure out how to do it, which is basically that all media, all creative media, all stories, all storytelling, whether it is video games, TTRPGs, board games, novels, movies, everything, all comes down to everything about the way that you create those games, you create those experiences, comes down to the rate, the order, and the manner in which you give your audience information. And one of the things that I find most interesting about hybridization is that adding more affordances, adding more manners in which you can give that information fundamentally changes both the other variables, so the rate and the order, but also changes the ways in which people experience that information. So for example, there is an extremely different feeling to, what's a good example? So say a game with a cutscene where, I haven't actually played this game myself, but there is a specific sort of feeling that you get for something like Final Fantasy. I think it's Final Fantasy. I'm about to get absolutely murdered.
If it's a cutscene, it's definitely Final Fantasy.
Where one of your characters dies. And it's a little bit contentious because it happens in a cutscene, it's part of the story, it's not skippable, it's not changeable, and the players are going, but I had so many Phoenix Downs, which, according to the mechanics, could have revived that character, but you just have to go with what's in the fiction because the cutscene is there. Compare that to something like the end of the first BioShock game, where the game does not progress. You cannot meet the win conditions of the game. You finish the cutscene, Andrew Ryan finishes talking, and the game does not progress until you, the player, push the sequence of buttons to kill Andrew Ryan. That, giving the agency back to the player, is an affordance of video games or of TTRPGs or games in general that does not exist for movies, for books, for things like that, at least not in the same manner and not able to be utilised in the same way. So I sort of see hybridization as taking that kind of, the manner of information conveying and the manner of making people feel or making people think about the information and using it to change how they experience the story. So looking at something like the difference between an ARG and a mega game starts to get interesting, because I think there's a lot of overlap between those two things, where there's ARG is sort of a, and I'm just going to use these as an example to sort of slide us into this conversation topic. So you've got an ARG, which is sort of my area of research, which is a game that can be played essentially individually, but requires a community to get the most out of it. So you're sharing information, but all the information is often gleaned by yourself. You go out, you collect things, you take them back to the group. Whereas a mega game is a much more inherently communal experience, I think.
Yeah.
So, and you've had some issues with corralling players into that communal experience as well. So
yeah, so there are a couple of really interesting points that that underpinned what you just said, including like informational uptake. And Sid's going to talk about action paths, and I'm going to let them do that. But one of the biggest challenges with Megagames is getting everyone on the same page about what is it that we are playing and how does it work. I also really quickly, you talked about this idea of agency, and there is a fantastic games philosopher, C.T. Nguyen, who has a book called Games, Agency as Art. He also has an episode on the Ezra Klein Show, which is a little bit more digestible, but I want to pin that because I find that area of thinking really fascinating. And it's the idea that the thing that makes games kind of an art form is that interactivity, that agency. You want to talk about action paths?
Yeah, that was so reminds of your mate's book, Emotions in Game, How Games Move Us.
Catherine Ibbister?
Yeah.
A Games Emotion by Design, I think
Thank
is
you.
hers.
Bless.
Yeah.
Yeah. I am well read for about 30 minutes after I read something, and then I lose the title.
I may have gotten that wrong, but we'll link it.
It's action paths, which Nellie references, a theory of design that I have that relates to players conducting verbs, the way that players play games, being influenced by how they understand the game state and what actions are available to them. And one of the things that is interesting in this digital discussion is that if we imagine the two spectrums to be, I really understand what's going on and I don't understand what's going on, and I can do 1,000 different things, or I can do, two things that are very different. If we imagine that to be the spectrum, digital games tend to be, I am very well oriented to my game state. I understand my mechanics, I understand my current position, I understand, four-dimensionally, I'm able to project my current position forward in space and understand the consequences of that. But I can only do the 6 things that the designer has decided that I can do, I'm playing Call of Duty and I have a really good understanding of what is in front of me and the risks of that, but all I can do is move, shoot, crouch. They're the 3 sort of verbs that I have access to. And analog games on the back end of that tend to be, I'm very poorly, especially when we talk about analog games that don't use physical representations. So Megagames, which are a big shared information, big shared fictional space, TTRPGs, which are a much smaller shared fictional space, or solo puzzle games, and even ARGs where mystery and not fully understanding the context is a big part of how those games work. Those games tend to be exploratory in nature in that they're about, I have 1,000 things I can do. I have no idea what any of them do, but if I start probing at those edges, then I can start experiencing the world differently and the feedback will tell me what's going on. Really great example of that is you walk into a room. How big is it? It's a 10-foot room. Is there a door? Like that is a player doing that, like probing at the space, trying to orientate themselves to game state.
I often describe the GM in TTRPGs as the window to the world. And it's often why, and this came up when we were speaking last time, puzzle design for TTRPGs, bad, don't do it. Like it's just really hard to do very well.
Yes. Puzzles rely on, I'm very well oriented to the consequences of the decisions that are in front of me, but I don't have many ways to interact with that, and so it's interesting to kind of like figure out what those are. Or on the back end of that, games that are, I don't know what these things do, but I only have a few actions, but I don't know what they're going to do to the world. And they're usually games that have like weird physics associated with them, so that players can like guess and check and test and stuff like that. And that environment, like being able to hybridize, and I would say that games like Gloomhaven are the first step in that hybridization of like, instead of just doing D&D with a shared fictional space, we're going to create a map, a board map with figures and cards and spaces, and that is going to be representative of our fiction. And then we go a little bit further and we say, cool, now instead of that, and it's kind of telling that like when we get into games that are digital, we tend to be testing things like twitch skills, short-term decision making, like short timeline decision making, observation and reaction. And when we get into analog spaces, we tend to be testing things like decision making, morality in the grey areas, long-term like character build level, like strategic decision making. Chess, that big strategic, can you see the lines decision making? And that's where I want to see design move forward, is by taking those elements that digital's doing well, the elements that analog's doing well, and finding again that wavefront, finding where those two things meet, as opposed to what I see doing now, which is digital's really good at this, let's put it in analog space. Or vice versa.
And I think we are going to run into some issues with that because, as you say, those are two very different information states. And being able to preserve an information state of, I know all of the things that are going on, I have a full understanding of how the rules will affect this situation, and then wanting to include analog responsiveness into that, that is a hard sell without making the game not necessarily trivial, but without actually robbing a lot of the space that analog uncertainty provides. Lucy, you were agency and like decision making within games, I think, sort of feeds into your area of things. Do you have any
Yeah, I mean, so a lot of my research really looks into how players in multiplayer digital games interact with each other and how they come to make decisions about what's acceptable and what isn't acceptable to do, often to each other in a game. Like, can I call you that in this game, whereas I might not call you that in another circumstance? And people have very different ideas about, and the play environment and the digital environment really, really shapes those kinds of decisions that we end up making and the judgments that we make about what's acceptable and what isn't. And I haven't really, it's something that's really interesting, but I haven't really thought about how that compares to, say, a multiplayer environment when we actually are sitting around a table together. Because there is that huge difference between the immense amount of toxicity that we encounter in multiplayer digital games when we have a whole bunch of people playing together, often strangers, and this kind of...
That's so fascinating because we have very, very, very few. We've done 12 or 13 Megagames now in the time that Melbourne Megagames has been running. I actually cannot think of an instance of any level of conflict that has come close to the kind of toxicity that you have engaged with in your work. And it's, to me, the obvious answer for that is that, well, you would never say that to someone's face.
Exactly.
But it's exactly the same scenario that was described. If it's a big group of strangers coming together to play a game.
I want to sort of draw on that a little bit because I think, at least in my experience, looking at especially the indie TTRPG design space, I work with a lot of indie TTRPG designers with events and things. The conversation at the moment about how to encourage particular dynamics at the table, especially around sort of keeping everybody safe and that sort of consent structures, are really in their infancy.
Yeah.
Because for a long, long time, there was a real culture, I think, of assuming that people would know how to do that as a consequence of being actors in society. And that idea of like, you wouldn't say that to someone's face. And that does hold true in a lot of senses, in that there is a lot of toxicity online that I think exists in some spaces physically, but doesn't always carry through, because physically having someone sit in front of us does have an effect on our behaviour and what we do consider to be acceptable behaviour. And I think in-person spaces, there is a lot more real-time, fully like holistic reactions. Like, you can not only hear someone's voice, you can see their body language, you can watch them react, whereas digital spaces, you're often restricted to only one or two of those modes of communication, maybe even only text, which gives us a lot more cues to calibrate social interactions, which is, I mean, it's important, and it's something that has sort of let TTRPGs not limp by, but get away without a lot of structured systems for this kind of negotiation. But we have noticed that it is starting to come to a point where we're thinking about these things of like, how do I encourage players to put in these systems to like check in with each other, to do negotiations, to avoid circumstances like, oh, I thought we were playing this kind of game, what do you mean your character goes and does this? Which is, and I think, I see you making thinky faces.
Yeah, because that's, so I guess context for people who don't have like a lot of RPG history behind them, but this sort of stuff about how do we communicate with each other comes up in the early 2000s, kind of spearheaded by a pair, Meg Baker and Emily Care-Boss, who kind of come out with like 3 different approaches of how to play in uncomfortable spaces, right? One of them is no one gets hurt. You don't want to, play a game where children are at risk, we don't play that game. One of them is called To the Pain, which is we will do it up to a point in which you're uncomfortable, and we will stop before it becomes hurtful, but not before it becomes unpleasant. So like, we want to bring into the unpleasantness without getting hurt.
Or perhaps becomes hurtful but doesn't become damaging. Might be a better way of
pain without suffering.
That's
kind of the toolkit I use for that. And then the last one is I Will Not Abandon You, which is we're going to have a game where there's things that are terrible and we're going to feel terrible about them, but we're kind of collectively going to then come out the other side and do the things we need to care for each other. The reason that sort of comes out in the 2000s, when RPGs kind of start back in like 1980s, late 1970s, is because that's when we start playing games that aren't, where we don't have the very clear guidelines that we had in original D&D. In original D&D, if you went and sat down at the table and said, hey, I just want to like put my hand up and say, I really want a game where like children get injured, people would look at you with quizzical faces, because children didn't get injured in D&D. You went into a dungeon and you fought things that came from a little plastic bag, little plastic toys. You fought like owlbears and bullays and stuff. And the idea that you would have a D&D game that had anything that would have emotional resonance, that you would like resonate with besides the hero's journey, was madness. And so we've kind of come to a position, and in the same way, video games rough at the same timeline, 1990s, 1980s. Imagine sitting in front of a game of, Super Mario Galaxy and being like, really hope there's no torture scenes in this. Like, the idea that these games have content that is hurtful, that is not the content that's plastered on the box, is really new. People are still talking about Spec Ops: The Line, which is a 2007?
7, I think.
Yeah.
6, 7, something like
Yeah, someone Google me. 2007 game where it's a game that's meant to play on your desire to play a shooter, and it asks you questions like, or it asks the character questions like, I bet you feel like a hero now, which is aimed firmly down the barrel at the player. Essentially at the moment, the digital game space is not giving people stuff that's like, that they have to opt out of, or that they need aftercare through the end of, because it's not part of the culture of play. If we look like ethnographically at video games, it would be unexpected to join a game of Fortnite and say, hey, I actually think it'd be really rude if we all shot each other. We should probably just like build houses together. Because that's
I've done that before.
absolutely, and that kind of like violation of like play norms is like good and fun. But when someone comes along and shoots you, you can't feel personally offended by it, right? That's what you're born into.
Yeah, those are some of the interesting questions that came up in
Yes.
my studies, actually.
Yes.
That actually people do disagree very much on whether or not that's an okay thing to do.
Mhm.
Like, some people would say, hey, if it's against the rules or it's against the unspoken rules of the game, then too bad. Like, if you do, you forfeit, basically.
It's Marcus Carter, who is another fantastic games researcher. He's now at the University of Sydney, I believe. Has a whole book about transgressive play.
Yeah.
I've forgotten the name of it. It might actually just be.
Is it just transgressive play? No.
It's all about transgressive play,
Yeah.
which is that playing in that uncomfortable space. Very related to your work, Lucy.
Yes.
Play Unsafe? Was that Marcus Carter?
I don't know.
We had EVE Online.
So it's all about EVE Online.
Yeah.
EVE Online.
Treacherous play.
That's it.
Treacherous play. Hey. Yeah. That's it. I didn't mean to interrupt.
I don't know where that thought was going.
But that also does bring us to one of the really important points, I think, about hybridizing, which is that diegetic and non-diegetic elements, or that is elements that are contained wholly within the game and are part of the experience. So think of background music. So there's music in games that is like the character is playing a radio, and the characters can hear the radio behind their conversation. That's diegetic music. Non-diegetic music is the background music that is playing that is setting the mood for the audience, but that the characters do not implicitly hear as part of the scene. So just for those not familiar with the terms that we're using. But when we're looking at what is diegetic and what is non-diegetic, we start to run into, and I'm going to loop you back to the puzzle games, and you should never use them, because there's a big thing of, in a game of Dungeons and Dragons, why can't I roll initiative to solve this puzzle? Because you may be playing a character that is highly intelligent and very good at puzzle solving, whereas perhaps you're a more emotionally intelligent person in real life and have never solved any of a puzzle to this extent. Does it break the fiction for you that your character is not able to solve that? And then you get to like the digital game Spec Ops: The Line, because you are playing in first person, having the character that you are talking to address the player directly can be considered, address the character directly, can in some ways be considered tantamount to addressing the player directly, or it can be taken that way because the player is meant to be projecting themselves onto that character. And the different ways in which these mediums manage diegesis and separation of character and player can be a very interesting, maybe another point of conflict that makes it difficult to hybridize an experience because you're fundamentally operating on two different frameworks.
I think this is where I land on hybrid games, is that when it comes to like hybrid board games, I just think it's fun and it's neat and it's really cool, and that all of the steps forward in that space are even when there are games where like the app feels maybe a little bit tacked on and a little bit more on that gimmicky end of the spectrum, it's still good and fun. And that's partly more to do with, I think, my personal approach to what board games are and why I play them. When it comes to tabletop RPGs and like that more narrative and what I feel is much more fulfilling kind of play, that's where the hybridization makes me more nervous, and I observe that it is not done as effectively. And that's partly to do with the complexity of those types of games, but then there are some very, very simple RPGs.
Yeah.
I don't know, that's my thought.
Yeah, I have a pretty large theory on this, that not all of it is going to be able to be put into words now. But what I will say is that digital and analog do different things.
Yes.
And players come to them like expecting different things, right? This is, you and I have spoken before about playing to learn versus playing to prove and that sort of thing. And one of the things that digital does very well is like clean resolution and high trust environments and structured predictive models. And one of the things that analog does very well is emotional resonance and creativity and expression, and allowing players to like self-express in a way that is not, my character wears a different coloured hat. And it's, I think that when we talk about hybridization, we're probably going to come up closer to your work on spheres of play in Megagames, which is like, can you give us like a short thing on spheres of play so that I can speak to it?
Yes. So one of the ways that we describe, so Megagames are very, very new. They come from the tradition of wargaming, but as it is for megagame design, we are like putting the train tracks down as we are driving the train. And it's really, when I started on that, like I thought there was just nothing about game design in general, and now I'm halfway through a PhD engaging with that, but it feels very sparse. So one of the terms that we use to unpack megagames, which are, I'm now going to explain what they are. I said Google at the start, I'm sorry. 30 to 200 players in a room for 6 to 8 hours, playing a game that usually goes through a series of rounds. So it'll be like you'll do phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, reset. Again and again and again, like 8 to 12 times. Within that, you'll have people playing on teams. The standard form of operation is that you'll have your little team time where you're like, hey guys, what are we going to do? And then you'll split up and you'll go to different sections of the game, which is probably one of the easier ways of understanding what a game sphere is. Because sometimes they are the physical space that you're in, but sometimes they're a little bit more abstract and it's more about a collection of mechanics. So you can have a game sphere that's like in Watch the Skies, which is the most well-known mega game. You have the UN, and that is a game sphere that is just a room that the players who are going to the UN go and sit in, and it's defined by its like physical separation from everything else. And then you have the game sphere that is more about like the interaction with the aliens in Watch the Skies. And that one is not physically defined because the aliens are in a separate room and they come in and they do things on the map and the human players are like, oh my God, what's happening? And then they leave again. And the way that players can interact with the aliens is defined by a very specific set of mechanics. It's not physically located. Mm-hmm. Does that give you the ground to walk on about this?
Thank you so much. So what that sort of shows me is that, like the way that Megagames are these collections, actually the one thing that isn't spoken about there that is important in discussing spheres of play are where those Venn diagrams kind of overlap, right? And that the demands of the game are that someone will come to the UN and say, I would like to assert something about how we deal with the aliens. Yeah. And so one sphere of play necessitates interaction with another sphere of play. And that's what we're really... That's what I want to see in hybrid futures is, for at least the first couple of years, I think it'd be very ambitious for people to go in and try and do fully, like, integrated worlds where digital and analog overlap. I think, to be honest, to start with, for these first like 10% before we hit this tipping point adoption thing, it's going to be about spheres of play, and it's going to be about having a digital sphere, having an analog sphere, letting those two interact, but ensuring that they are utilising their own strengths to throw fun and interesting weaknesses. And that's what, so you mentioned Megagames come out of wargaming, and like my first years in game design was essentially that. You would take fighter pilots, I would sit them in front of models of aircraft or a whiteboard, and we would tabletop our way through a fight, and they would negotiate, and we would do endogenous design, and we would create the rules that we wanted to play by. What do you think is the percentage chance that this maneuver will work? Oh, probably about 30%. And then I would take them to their simulators, their full Hornet cockpit, full screen surround simulator, put the helmet on, and I would type missile defeat chance 30%. And we would integrate that analog negotiation into the digital play. And then the analog is designed to step them through, develop teaching opportunities, negotiation, endogenous design. And then the simulation is really important because that is where you get to prove whether or not things work. Because in an analog system, the squadron leader fighter pilot will always say, and then I defeat that missile. And I'll say, oh, can you turn through 135 degrees in half a second? Yeah, of course I can. All right. And then we go to a simulator and we do it. And they say, and then I defeated the missile. No, you didn't. But I can turn through, you did it. I watched you do it.
Yeah.
You can't, not only can't you did not. And so that like using one sphere to reinforce another sphere is where I think digital is going to be really strong, and where analog is going to be really supportive and well structured and complementary. Yeah.
I want to talk very briefly about a project that I think you're also attached to, this Melbourne 2050 that Leah and I have done some work on. We're just waiting for funding basically to progress it.
Yeah.
That is.
So if you're out
there. But it's got several parts, but the idea is that it's this imaginative a mega game with some other ARG bits associated of what Melbourne would be like in 2050, and it's got this really like deep community core. And then I also wanted to design a mega game that was quite subversive, and so I have taken elements from the strongest inspiration is Ready Player One. And so the mega game concept that I kind of pitched was this idea that you have this internal game where players have an avatar that they create using some kind of like biometric system. So they upload their face, and the system says you have a charisma of 10 because you're ugly, and an intelligence of 15 because you're wearing glasses. This was not targeted, I'm sorry, and so on. And that would be the avatar that they would have to play with in the internal world. And then at the same time, the external world, they'd be playing kind of as themselves. And the idea was to really incentivize them to play in the internal world and to ignore what was happening in the external world, where like the world was going to be crumbling because climate change. And it was a game where I was like, don't worry about the practicalities of how you're going to execute this, because I organize mega games. Every time I'm engaging with a game, I'm like, okay, but how's that going to run? So this one, I kind of put that to the side. And I just wanted to talk and like have that as maybe some speculative conversation that we could have around like that space. One of the other ideas I had was that I was going to have the role of God essentially in this internal world, and I was going to use an AI to do it and to have the players think that they were interacting with a person. So in Megagames, they're run by Control, who are basically the group of GMs. Sometimes facilitators is an easier word for it. So I was going to have it represented by a facilitator, so players are like talking to that person, thinking they are talking to a human, and that person is on a computer, typing into ChatGPT and giving the answers that ChatGPT is giving. Because I thought that was interesting and subversive and challenges player expectations of what a mega game is and how it works.
Yes. It's not necessarily a hybrid game, but there's a toy project I'm working on to partially to learn a bit of game programming. And partially to have a little bit of an explore of some of these kinds of things, where basically it is it's a text-based RPG adventure where it's the sort of thing, the text pops up on the screen, it is dark, you're likely to be eaten by a group, and you pick from a certain number of dialogue options in order to, dialogue or action options to progress the game. You know, I walk west. Someone has asked me a question, I say, yes, I would like a coffee, or do I want to say, no thanks, I'll just have water, like that kind of thing. But the idea is that as you go through the game, it gets, I don't know if you've ever been playing an RPG and you've picked a dialogue option and you've gone, okay, you know, I want to like be nice to this person, I'll say this, oh no, that was the sarcastic response. But the idea is that as you go from the game, the dialogue choices get more and more misleading. So as you go, it becomes harder and harder to play the character that you want to play and say the things that you want to say, because the dialogue is actively attempting to interpret the option that you are clicking in the way that is not implied by the context. Yeah, you're making that face up like that's exactly what I want players to do. And it is going to, and this is why I think this links back into the hybridization, but it's going to subverting expectations of the system. And it is something you can do with a rigid system like a digital system that is semi-responsive in a way that would feel like an utter betrayal in an analog system or a person-mediated system.
And what comes to mind when you both started talking about sort of AI being involved in these things is that, okay, so we're starting to do some research with some local game companies looking at how people interact with AI in a games context. And one of the things we're starting to hear is that people really, really can get very abusive with AIs. And it's just sort of, it's this interesting, it's something that I think not everyone would necessarily expect if they're designing a game with AI involved, that the way players relate to that figure might be very, very different to how they relate to a human. And so it's sort of, if you're thinking about introducing AI, and our relationship to AI is still evolving, and we're still just trying to wrap our heads around what AI can even do. It suddenly just jumped out at us, I think, with ChatGPT, and we're like, what? It knows all this stuff. And our relationship to it is changing so fast that it's kind of an interesting space. I think unexpected things might happen there as well.
It's interesting that you say that, because there's also been some research done around how people like talk to Google or Siri or Alexa.
Yes.
And how that links to the fact that they all have female voices.
Yes.
And it's really interesting when that is still happening with ChatGPT, and that is like completely genderless.
Yeah.
Because you would assume from that first set of cases that it is a gender thing, and then so maybe it isn't. It's something in that technology space.
It's a power thing, which we just happen to associate with
Yeah.
gender because of several thousand years of history.
Intersex. Yeah.
One of the things that comes up when we talk about AI, especially like AI in games and whatever, is this idea, this method of speaking about it, that it is like one thing, and that it is all encompassing, and that it is intelligent or thinking or whatever. And like, I am not an engineer. I am not particularly intelligent, but I do what I understand of AI at the moment when we talk about like a ChatGPT sort of thing, is it is a constructive language model that has been trained on a lot of data so that it appears to be smart because it can put words next to each other that are usually put next to each other. And that the reason that we have so many problems with like, I think they were calling them like hallucinations, but like with errors, with wrong things, with lies coming out of the mouths of language models, is because they're not thinking, they're not modeling, they're just putting words next to each other.
Yeah.
And so the comment that comes up a lot with AI is like, oh, it's people and the AI, and they are the two, like player and AI are the two personalities involved. But I really want to like reassert this, and I am like a big like death of the author, like Barthian kind of approach to my work. For me to start saying we need to reinsert the designer back into the conversation, like I'm taking a stand. But we need to start talking about that, about the fact that like the person who decides which version of language model you use, what information set you train that language model on.
Yeah.
Like that's a design decision, you know. As a designer, for designers that are engaged in this, inserting AI into your game and I have absolute faith in you. But a thing to keep in mind is if you just insert like ChatGPT, then essentially a large part of your game design has been done by people who are not designing towards your goals.
That's why I thought it was funny to make that God.
Yes. Speaking of people not working towards my goals.
Well, it also, I feel like from what you described, it also functions as a kind of an art piece. Like it prompts reflection on exactly these kinds of questions, right?
Which is one of the awesome things about that project, is that it lets us do something with a game that is not always considered the purpose of a game.
Yeah, I think it is telling that I'm sitting at a table with 3 academics and my primary source of income is making consumer games.
Yeah.
And consulting on people who make consumer games. I don't approach a lot of stuff from the it's an art piece perspective.
Yeah.
So it's really cool to be here and hear the idea of subversive design as a method of interrogating its place in gaming is really cool for me.
Yeah. I mean, that's great, but also we're literally still waiting on funding for it. There is something else happening under that.
Yeah.
Is there anything else we want to talk about?
No, I was actually going to say before we sort of did that, there was a couple of really nice mic drop moments there that I was about to jump in on, but that's okay, we can go from here. So I will, because we did a bit of faffing around at the start, we've got some time, so I will just close us out on one last question, which is I'm going to ask you all to give me a brief one-sentence definition of your ideal definition of hybridization in games, and they have to all be different to each other.
Oh my gosh.
But I'm going to let you jump in whatever order you want.
The definition of
hybrid, or a one-sentence summary of hybridization in your ideal case. So if I were to say my ideal definition of hybridization, I would say that hybridization is using the affordances and tactics of different styles of play and different methods of art making to complement each other and to create an experience that is greater than the sum of its parts.
Okay.
So,
all right, and the 3 of us just take that one.
Yeah.
We all agree. Goodbye.
Look, I think I really also I want to focus on that affordance part as well, but what I'm going to do is draw from my research into ethics and the way people communicate with each other, and say that my ideal form of hybridization would be one that is mindful of the norms and rules and so on that we associate with both the digital and the non-digital. And yeah, by mindful, I mean taking into account both of those spheres and where they overlap so that we can create experiences for people that are still ultimately enjoyable and inclusive and fun and where we can actually care for one another.
This will be more than a sentence. Digital games for a long time have defined themselves by aesthetic genre trappings. So things like first-person shooter, defining itself by a verb and a camera position. I think that hybridization demands that we stop thinking about things in terms of genre and aesthetics and start thinking about things in terms of play experience and dynamics, because the thing that will be consistent between digital and analog spaces will be the player and the player experience. And I know that MDA and big model frameworks are a little bit out of fashion now, but I'll echo back to it just to say we need to move away from a mechanical or an aesthetic view of games, and hybridization is built on the dynamics, on the interactions between those.
I'm going to go back to kind of what I said at the start and also basically say what Lee said but in different words, which is that the ideal definition of hybridization to me is something that can only exist in that form. So it is not something that you could make purely analog or purely digital. It is something that can only be made. And this actually does link to some of the other work I've done, particularly with like museums and VR, where there is a tendency, I'm going way off on a tangent with this, there is a tendency to overlay VR on exhibitions. And actually the best VR experiences that you can have in a museum are the ones that were designed for VR. And that's the analog to digital hybrid games in that space.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks, everybody who's here for watching, and thank you three for being here with me and having such wonderful opinions. I'll just take us through one more time. Names and social media, or where people can interact with you, or, you know, if you want that to be a thing.
So I'm Nellie. You can find me miscellaneously on the internet. I'm on the platform formerly known as Twitter as @defeater of frogs, and that will be the fastest way to get my attention if you want to talk to me. Otherwise, I'll put an email in the show notes.
Yeah, my name is Sidney Icarus. The best way to find me is at waxwings.com.au.
I have a website too! Sorry! It's new.
Do you want to take yours again?
No,
you can find Nellie also at Waxwings. She can send me an email and yeah.
I'm at nellieseale.com. Sorry.
I will put that in the show notes as well for like spellings and things.
That's, yeah, Seale with an E.
Yeah, Seale with an E. Two.
Anywhere else? Anywhere else for you? Okay.
Yeah, if you're in Melbourne, if you're in Melbourne or Vancouver soon maybe, reach out to me. I love to connect with people, drink, talk about this stuff, have coffee.
My relationship with social media is mixed. I would say the best place to reach out to me would be on the most boring platform of all, LinkedIn. Just look me up, Lucy Sparrow.
I love it. Perfect. And I have been Lee Cope. I may not be Lee Cope in the future. We'll see where we go with this. But you can find me, best place you can find me is go to whimsyandmetaphor.com. Again, link in the notes. And there'll be a bunch of icons on the screen that will tell you where to contact me on social media, should you so desire. Thank you once again, everybody. This has been a wonderful panel.
Thank you,
Academics and
Lee. Yes,
Associates
thank you.
out.
Thank you.